Hey there, History 1218 students. Again, this is Mr. Maddox coming to you with a videotaped commentary for Chapter 9. Chapter 9 in our text is describing the market revolution. Takes place in American history between 1800 and 1840. During this time period in American history, there's going to be a number of really, really important things happening. And this is going to be one of the moments in American history where we transition from, I think this is important in terms of students' understanding of American history. At some point, we kind of changed from being a very historically kind of old-fashioned nation to perhaps a more modern nation. And this time period and these rapid changes in the market revolution between 1800 and 1840 are really, really going to be profoundly impactful in kind of moving America from a more traditional economy to an economy that resembles, at least, the economy that we have today. So let's take a look at this. If we look at slide number 3, we get a little bit of a preview. Slide number 3 is a piece of art that is a Conestoga wagon on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. So roads and transportation technology is going to be a huge, huge player in fact, this market revolution. So slide 4 looks at a little bit of a lecture preview. There's a new economy, obviously, a market society for the free individual, and finally we're going to end up talking about limits on prosperity. Slide number 5 asks the focus question: what were the main elements of the market revolution? That seems to be probably the most relevant question. What's the most one of the most pronounced features of this market revolution? So you take a look at slide 6. Roads and steamboats is the first bullet point. Roads and steamboats cannot be overstated. Most roads prior to 1800 were little more than just kind of ruts in the dirt. They could be washed out during inclement weather. They would be unpassable. We take it for granted today, but if we want to get from point A to point B, we can simply get in a car and drive on a really, really flat surface that allows for kind of speed and mobility that we really, really can't imagine that not being the case. Well, prior to 1800, and whether you can believe it or not, there was actually road technology that emerged in terms of the layers of material one would use to build a road so that it could drain water properly and so that it could be really, really flat and yet really, really solid for members of the public to travel across. Before this era, roads were terrible, and people would schedule things during times of year where they knew the roads were passable. After this market revolution, we're going to see roads being utilized year-round and constructed to be utilized year-round. One of the big changes that took place in terms of roads was the creation of turnpikes. Turnpikes were roads that were built between two points by private companies. And these private companies would go ahead and maintain the road, and they would charge people to use the road. This is the idea of toll booths. Now, you guys growing up in California, we do not have a bunch of toll roads, but right now in the United States on the East Coast, there are a number of toll roads. A number of toll roads that you can take. They're all operated by the government. Um, Now, but back in the market revolution, they were operated by actual for-profit companies. Not many of these companies actually made any profit because it's very hard to limit someone's ability to use the road. So a lot of people would simply create little paths to get around the toll booths, um, and cheat a little bit. But the idea of road making really coming to preeminence during this time is extremely important. Um, we can see it just in the last chapter when we talked about the Whiskey Rebellion. The reason that the Massachusetts farmers were transporting, well, the reason that they were creating a bunch of whiskey from their crops instead of just transporting the crops to market in the form that they were just after the harvest. It was because that they couldn't get them across the roads. The roads were unpassable, and the roads were very, very difficult, and it was much less efficient to try and transport the entire crop to market than to distill it into whiskey, and then you can take that whiskey to market and you can get a better price for your trouble because there isn't the transportation costs involved. So transportation is really, really important in the early 1800s in terms of the revolutionary impact. Not only roads, but steamboats. Robert Fulton is going to make a commercially viable steamboat available at this time. In 1807 on the Hudson River, he's going to show that the commercial steamboat is absolutely peerless in terms of its ability to navigate up and down rivers. Now, the big difference here is everyone could come down a river very easily. When you're moving with the current, coming down the river is very easy, and you can make it quite quickly in terms of transportation. The big ticket with a steamboat is you can actually get up a river. You can go up against the current, and this opens up a transportation network that is really, really underutilized at this time. It's not enough to engage in trade that only goes one direction. If water flows one direction, it's not going to be able to build you a trade network that is going to be as expansive and vast as a network that can be utilized where you have flow of goods and people in both directions. And this is really what the steamboat symbolizes. We're going to see not only steamboats revolutionize things very, very quickly and essentially move into every waterway in the United States, especially the Mississippi River. Being able to navigate up and down the Mississippi River very quickly on a steamboat is going to be, again, absolutely revolutionary. But not only are we going to see the rise of the steamboat, but there is another waterway innovation, and that is the second bullet point on slide 6, and that's the Erie Canal. And canals, generally speaking, prior to the building of the Erie Canal, the longest canal in the world was something like 26 miles. The Erie Canal would be 300 plus miles. It would stretch from the Hudson River in upstate New York to the Great Lakes region, and it would literally link um, would literally link the excellent port of New York City to the Great Lakes region. And you cannot possibly overestimate the importance of the Erie Canal in terms of solidifying New York's position as the preeminent trade center of the United States. Once the Erie Canal is finished, it is the first major canal in the United States linking to huge markets for goods and productive capacities. So, the success of the Erie Canal revolutionized the marketplace and certainly brought together the markets of New York with the market of the Great Lakes region. That success spurred investments in canal building all across the United States. And in fact, if you look at the slide 7, you'll see a map of the United States, and that map shows all of the main roads, navigable sections of river, main canals, and then canals that are planned. And so you can see that there is already in 1840, there's an extensive network of roads and canals all across the United States. If you look at slide 8, that is an artist's representation of the Erie Canal. You can see along the side of the canal there's a track for horses. Horses would be used to pull flatboats up and down the canal. You cannot imagine the revolution in shipping. That was a canal. If you look in that artist's representation, you can see that a team of horses used to pull a huge flatboat might just be 1 or 2 horses. If you had to load all of that cargo onto a wagon, there's no way that 2 horses could pull that wagon successfully any distance. So that brings the cost of shipping way, way down. Way, way down. Slide number 9. Steam and sail in New York Harbor. Again, with the completion of the Erie Canal, the harbor at New York is absolutely going to be the preeminent place for conducting economic transactions in the United States. Slide number 10 shows an integrated and diverse market economy. The plow, the loom, and the anvil. These are all implements that, certainly the anvil isn't something that gets created in the 1840s, but the plow and the loom are things that are going to kind of revolutionize the industrialization process. Let's take a look at slide 11. Slide 11 is highlighting this. Again, I'm saying all these things are extremely important, but think about how life has changed since the advent of the internet. What does the internet do? The internet allows for the transportation of potentially goods and services to be executed much more quickly than the era prior to the advent of the internet. It allows things to proceed much, much more quickly over vast distances. It is not a transportation revolution per se, but it is a revolution in transmitting information across vast distances that is allowing people to conduct economic transactions much more quickly. All these transportation revolutions happening during the market revolution from 1800 to 1840, taken all together, I mean, the revolution of the internet is probably one of the most impactful events in the history of the United States and the world. But these transportation innovations happening all in rapid succession, very, very quickly, is probably the second most impactful revolution in terms of economic change in the United States. So we talked about roads, we talked about steamboats, we talked about canals, but really the most important transportation innovation of the time, for sure, is going to be the railroad. And the railroad is far and away going to accomplish more than any other technology what Alexis de Tocqueville refers to as the annihilation of space and time. The railroad is going to allow someone to travel from the eastern portion of the United States to the western portion of the United States in times that were unthinkable before the railroad. The railroads would essentially negate the huge advantages that were gained by the canals. The canals were fantastic, and so many people invested in canals. And the trouble with a canal is you had to hire a bunch of people to dig a ditch for miles and miles and miles and miles and miles. And that thing had to be level, and that thing had to have a whole bunch of requirements to make it a workable canal. When the advent of the railroad comes along, it is going to be much more cost effective to lay down railroad ties and railroad tracks rather than having people dig ditches. So a lot of canal building is going to be halfway completed, and then the railroads are going to kind of supplant them as the premier technology. It's going to kind of be like there is still somewhere in the world a bunch of music contained on CDs, but now nobody really traffics in that anymore because streaming music is essentially the premier technology for delivering that service. But somewhere, all these CDs still exist in the economy somewhere. Think if you had invested $100 million in putting all sorts of music on CD, and then you find out, next month that there's this new technology called streaming music. This is essentially what happens with canal builders, who then get pushed out of the way by railroad operators. The first working railroad in the United States was the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. It began in 1828. From 1828 to 1860, the U.S., it wasn't really the U.S. government, but all the states and all the private actors laid down 30,000 miles of railroad track in the United States. That might not seem like a lot, but for just 32 years, to lay down 30,000 miles of railroad track is something really remarkable, especially when 30,000 miles of railroad track in 1860 was more than all the rest of the railroad track laid in every country of the world. So the United States really moved quickly to adopt railroad technology. And the steam engine and the railroad, again, so important in moving population and the market connections westward across the United States. The other side of this is the telegraph. The telegraph was first commercially used in 1844. Samuel Morse, a very interesting story. Samuel Morse was not an inventor who invented something and was looking for the application. He was someone who had something very tragic happen in his life, and he did not get the news in time to avert the tragedy. So he decided that he wanted to design something that was going to be able to transmit news and information very, very quickly from point A to point B. So he develops a telegraph and develops the system, the Morse code, which allows you to, by clicking dots and dashes, electrical impulses through the lines, allows you to communicate information very, very quickly across a huge distance. And this is going to be absolutely key for integrating large geographic areas into one economy, to be able to kind of see what the prices were in some other market, in some other geographic area, and use those prices to kind of regulate the prices in the market that you were operating in, is a tremendous advantage, to be sure. Let's take a look at slide number 12. Slide number 12 is an artistic representation from 1884 called the Locomotive DeWitt. Locomotive DeWitt Clinton. DeWitt Clinton, obviously the governor of New York. It's a artistic representation showing a number of things. Number one is the locomotive. Number two is the canal. Number three is the road. This was included by Foner, obviously, to show the different transportation technologies all together in one place. Take a look at slide 13. Slide 13 on the borderlands in the west. All these transportation and communication improvements fostered just a ton of ability and a ton of growth in the West region, a ton of ability for growth in the Western region of the United States. It's not enough to say that it allowed people to move to the western portion of the United States. It really created all these transportation and communication technologies, allowed them to move to the West and become an integrated part of an economy. The West had always been a place geographically where someone could strike out and try to obtain some land, and then kind of act self-sufficiently as a farmer out there in the West, as a unit unto themselves. They could potentially participate in that, but with the advent of the communication and transportation technology, moving west does not necessarily mean in this era that you are going to be some isolated actor living by yourself out on the frontier. with this market revolution, you could move west and still be an integrated part of the economy. It it made it more attractive to move west because there was a bunch of land, and you could cultivate that land, and you could bring that land under productive capacities, and then you could ship your goods back to the markets in the east very, very quickly. So that was going to spur tremendous growth, tremendous growth. Between 1790 and 1840, about 4.5 million people crossed the Appalachian Mountains to what was then considered the West. Again, that's a huge population shift. That is 4.5 million people. That's more people than were in the country during Washington's inauguration. So, just a tremendous flow of people to the west. The second bullet point on slide 13 talks about an internal borderland. The West in the United States history is always going to be repeatedly reimagined as an internal borderland. The West is going to, the faster people are moving westward and expanding westward, the more quickly and the more rawly those Americans are going to get into a situation where political authority is questionable, debatable, and power structures are necessarily going to be shifting and changing. Certainly, kind of most prominently, the power and the relationship between Native Americans and westward expanding Americans. But also, it's going to be a borderland in terms of the relationship between Black Americans and white Americans. Black Americans and white Americans are going to routinely have to try and remake race relations in the West as there is westward expansion in the United States. And one of the perennial questions is, as we add new states, as there is this tremendous westward expansion, what is going to be the status of slavery in those states? In the 1820s, 1840s, we're going to see the rise of slavery as the ultimate political question around which our country is going to obviously fight the Civil War. But we'll be looking at that in a later chapter. All right. Slide 14 looks at Western settlement from 1800 to 1820. Slide 15 takes a look at travel times from New York City in 1800 and 1830. So in 30 years, how much of a difference was there in terms of travel times? If you were leaving New York City, how far could you expect to go in the time it shows on the key? So on the key, it goes from I think 1 day to 6 weeks. You can see on the yikes. You can see on the map that there was a portion that was in the Great Lakes region from present day Michigan to northern Ohio to Illinois in 1800. This area was essentially off limits to people from the east. It would take 6 weeks for you to get from that portion of the United States to New York. And the fastest way to do it at that point in 1800 would be to get on a boat, get on a boat uh, as fast as you could and go down whatever rivers you could until you got to the Ohio River, which would get you to the Mississippi River, which would then lead you down to the port of New Orleans. And then the fastest way to get to New York would be to go ahead and jump on a ship in New Orleans that was bound for New York and then sail around the tip of Florida and sail up the east coast of the United States. By 1830, that was no longer the case. If you were in Michigan, if you were in Indiana and Ohio, Illinois, you could just hop on a train that would take you to a lake, that would take you to a canal, that would take you down down the Hudson River very, very quickly, and you would be in New York in a matter of, it goes from, 6 weeks to 6 weeks to 2 weeks. So it cuts your travel time tremendously. Really connects the rest of the United States. Slide 16 depicts a cabin in the woods. I always kind of smile when I see this because I grew up in Minnesota, and I spent many a day in cabins in the woods. Of course, it never quite looked like that. It was never actually in a log cabin, I don't think. On slide 17, it talks about the rise of cotton. Again, the impact of cotton on the United States economy cannot be overstated. In 1793, Eli Whitney produces an invention called the cotton gin. Up until that point, most people thought slavery was going to die out in the United States because the main crop that you could grow with slaves, was tobacco, and tobacco is very, very damaging to the soil, and it is absolutely essential if you're engaging in tobacco farming that you are going to plant tobacco for maybe a decade in one place, and then you have to move on. You have to go somewhere else, and you have to cultivate a tobacco field somewhere else because all that tobacco has leached all of the nutrients out of the soil. And so it was just hard to engage in a long-term sustainable tobacco production. However, and prior to 1793, growing cotton was more sustainable, but the cotton would require a bunch of people to pick cotton bolls, which is the actual fiber, and then they would have to sift through the actual cotton fiber and find the cotton seeds, and they would have to pull out the cotton seeds. And that was a tremendously painstaking task. In 1793, when Eli Whitney designs something called the cotton gin, this is a pretty simple machine where you could just put in a massive amount of just raw cotton, and then you could turn a crank, and the internal workings of the machine would separate the cotton fiber from the seed. This would allow essentially one person to do the work of just turning that gin and separating all the seeds out, and then everybody else could just harvest the cotton. It made cotton extremely, extremely profitable. It made cotton extremely, extremely profitable. And because it made cotton extremely, extremely profitable, it also made slavery extremely, extremely profitable. In 1793, when a cotton gin is produced, the United States as a whole produces 5 million pounds of cotton. within 30 years, we are producing 175 million pounds of cotton. Not only is this going to absolutely fuel industrialization in the textile industry, which is where industrialization is going to happen first, but it's also going to enrich the United States a huge, huge amount. And it's going to lead to slavery being more profitable than it was prior. So it's going to make sure that we import a vast number of slaves to this country, and that the slaves that are here are also going to be subject to an internal slave trade. So the Cotton Kingdom is point number one. Point number two says the unfree westward movement. This is referring to the thousands and hundreds of thousands of Black Americans that were taken in chains westward. As this country was expanding to the west, there were literally hundreds of thousands of Black Americans being taken in chains west as well. If you look at slide 18, you can see that it's the spread of cotton cultivation from 1820 to 1840. You can see where cotton was cultivated in 1820. Every one of those green dots represents, I believe, 2,000 bales of cotton. Let me just make sure that that's the case. Each dot represents 2,000 bales of cotton, yeah. And then you can see that there is just an incredible proliferation of green dots on the map at the bottom of the slide, showing that cotton not only has exploded in terms of the amount of growth, but it is also pressed westward, where it was in 1820. It was mainly concentrated in South Carolina and Georgia. You see that cotton production by 1840 is centered around the Mississippi River, Louisiana, Mississippi, geographically speaking. Take a look at slide 19. Slide 19 is population growth of selected western states from 1800 to 1850. And you can see that there is just a tremendous growth in all of these western states. Alabama goes from 9,000 people in 1810 to 40 years later, 700, almost 800,000 people. Unfortunately, many of them are going to be in chains. At any rate, slide 20 shows, in fact, a visual representation of the slave trading that was going on inside the United States and that unfree westward movement. Take a look at slide 21, asking a focused question: how did the market revolution spark social change? On slide 22, we see the bullet point: commercial farmers. One of the biggest evolutionary leaps forward in terms of integrating the national economy was the mechanization of agriculture. The mechanization of agriculture was absolutely tremendous in terms of not only the emergence of the Cotton Kingdom based on Eli Whitney's Cotton Gin, but there's also going to be John Deere is going to produce the first steel plow in 1837, and Cyrus McCormick is going to invent a mechanical reaper. It's going to allow just an incredible amount of wheat to be harvested. This is going to, again, make it so very, very profitable to move west and chase after large tracts of land, so that you can, again, put these lands under production using new agricultural technologies like the steel plow and the McCormick reaper, so that you can harvest a huge quantity of crop, and then you are going to have the transportation technologies to go ahead and ship that crop off to a market. A market being a place where there were just a ton of humans concentrated in one place that would consume all of that. Westward expansion prior to 1800 had been, again, subsistence farmers trying to go out, and most of the westward expansion was subsistence farmers going out and trying to live kind of off the grid, if you will, and just produce everything they needed for their homes and families on their own. After these market revolutions, we're going to see westward expansion being necessarily participated in by a bunch of people who are just trying to leverage commercial farming practices. You look at slide 23, the growth of cities. There's going to be a phenomenal growth of cities during this time. If you look at the next slide, slide 24, major cities in the United States. There would be a fantastic opportunity for people in cities to not only work in factories and urban workshops, but also you could actually live in a city, and there could be foodstuffs being transported in much greater quantity that would sustain larger and larger cities. So the growth of cities is really part and parcel to the, number one, the agricultural revolutions and the transportation revolutions that were going to allow major cities to be collection points of massive networks of goods and crops being brought in to sustain those folks. Certainly with the growth of cities, we're going to see the first bits of gentrification in the United States, where we've got cities that are rather homogenous, separating into enclaves of very rich people and very poor people, and we're going to see cities become places where you can see the entire socioeconomic spectrum from extreme wealth to extreme poverty right next to each other as well. Slide 25 shows Cincinnati in 1835. Cincinnati was certainly one of the contenders for the next major western city. Everybody knew after the Erie Canal that New York was going to be the preeminent city on the eastern seaboard in the United States. The question was, where would the preeminent western city be? And a bunch of places were in contention. Cincinnati was in contention. Pittsburgh was in contention. St. Louis, potentially. Ultimately, Chicago is going to rise up during this era. Chicago's rise during this era is absolutely remarkable. Absolutely remarkable. And it's going to rise because it will have rail and it will have waterways via the Great Lakes and the and the canal system to New York, and it will be the place where all the farmers of the Midwest want to take their crops because they can move them to markets in the East most effectively from Chicago. Slide number 26 says workshop in New York City. It is a artistic representation of a furniture shop in New York City, where you've got the factory boss in very, very fancy clothes, directing his laborers around. Furniture production was not yet mechanized, but it soon would be. Slide number 27 talks about the industrial expansion. It seems absolutely foreign to think that there was a time when Americans did not produce goods and services produce goods in factories, but this is actually the case. There was a time when if you wanted to make a bunch of shoes or a bunch of shirts, you would actually go ahead and produce the raw materials and source the raw materials and then drop off raw materials to a bunch of different workers' homes. You would actually have them working on these productive enterprises in their own homes. Once they got their goods completed, they would go ahead and put them out, and somebody would come around and collect all of those items up. And so home was the place where most economic activity was taking place in terms of producing manufacturing goods, home manufacturers. This is all going to change in the 1800s, the early 1800s. As industrial machines increase the scale of production, people are going to say, well, we should really concentrate all of our workers in one particular building, and then we should make them focus on just doing one particular part of the whole production process. And this would allow for greater efficiency and greater efficiency and greater efficiency. So this is really going to be the moment in time where we see manufacturing production in the United States switch from home production to factory production. It was first going to take place in textile mills. So a textile is anything. This is a textile. Anything that is made from woven cloth, woven yarn, woven fibers is a textile. And so that is going to be the first industry that moves along in terms of industrialization very, very quickly. The first factory in America was established in 1790 in Rhode Island, Pawtucket, Rhode Island. The machines that would really revolutionize the textile industry were the spinning jenny and the power loom. These machines were so closely guarded in terms of the secretive nature of them. The British made it illegal to take plans for machines out of Britain because Britain was first to industrialize. Well, there's a very enterprising young man named Samuel Slater who essentially had a photographic memory, or a very good memory. he memorized the plans for these machines and these spinning jennies, and he brought them to the United States and created a working factory using British technologies. And so essentially that kicked off the industrialization in the United States. Point number 2 talks about the industrial workers. The industrial workers. And industrial workers, whereas traditionally they had been producing manufactured items in their homes. In their homes, they could control the pace of their production and the conditions of their production. More and more industrial workers were going to be brought into factories where they couldn't control anything. They couldn't control the rate at which they were being asked to produce. They couldn't control the conditions under which they were working. And it was necessarily the case that while the market revolution opened up a bunch of opportunities for a bunch of Americans, certainly the American worker felt like they were losing a great deal of autonomy at this time. And they were starting to live life by time. If you were in a factory town, the factory whistle, steam whistle, would probably wake you up. Everybody knew at a certain time the steam whistle blew, and that meant that you had so many minutes, so much time to get down to the factory, and then the bell would be the steam whistle would blow again, and that meant that the first shift was starting, and then there would be another whistle when it was time to take a break, and it would just proceed like this the whole rest of the day. This is why a bunch of people kind of look at the system of education in our country run by bells as a throwback to this era. At any rate, slide number 28 is the proliferation of cotton mills in the 1820s. The cotton mills, obviously, taking cotton and spinning it into thread. This is textile production. All these cotton mills are going to be kind of highly concentrated in the New England area. And if you look at the map on slide 28, you can see that most of them are along, almost all of them are along waterways, and that's because the machinery at this point, had to be moved, had to be powered by water power. So this would mean you would build your factory wherever there was an advantageous, kind of naturally occurring water power. If you look at slide 29, it shows the mill on the Brandywine in Brandywine, Pennsylvania. This is a paper mill, but it kind of typifies the fact that it's going to be a factory located on the water because, well, it needs that water power to make its factory machinery work. This is slide number 30, shows the textile mill of Holyoke, Massachusetts, and the kind of schedule that you could expect from 5 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. You were going to be working with a few breaks. Slide number 31 talks about women in industry and refers to the mill girls. The mill girls are going to be a reference to the fact that a bunch of the New England textile factories were going to be operated mainly by women. They were going to be owned and potentially managed by men, but the people who were going to actually do the work were going to be women. Usually it was going to be young, unmarried women, um, women that had not really had any kind of meaningful way to engage in the economy before. The textile mill work was going to be one of the first massive ways for women to engage in the market economy in the United States. Um, one of the reasons why factory towns ended up being so regimented, especially factories that were trying to specialize, well, not trying to specialize, but that in fact were worked mainly by women, was because to send a young unmarried woman away to some place would necessarily be kind of anxiety inducing for a bunch of families. So those families were reassured when they found out that life in these factory conditions were going to be very strict, very regimented. There wasn't going to be a lot of free time for engaging in less than ladylike behavior. Slide 32 shows women at work tending machines in a textile mill. Slide 33 is more pictures of textile workers. This is from 1854, so it's a little outside the time period we're kind of focusing on, but would have been very typical of the textile industry. Slide number 34 talks about immigration to the United States. Immigration to the United States really, really explodes in this era, and it explodes for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is there is a very, very large potato famine in Ireland, and probably a third of the population of Ireland is going to move to the United States. So that is going to be a massive, massive immigration to the United States. Prior to this era, most of the population growth in the United States was attributable to birth rates and to just kids having babies, or Americans having babies. But during this time of industrialization and mechanization, we are going to see that the market economy is going to need workers to a very, very large extent, and those workers are going to come from foreign countries. The second point on slide 34 is Irish and German newcomers. There's going to be a great deal of German immigration, but generally those German immigrants are going to be possessed of more capital and more skills in terms of manufacturing and craftsmanship and skills of that nature. So they weren't going to be the most likely candidates to be working in factories and working in industrial capacities. The Irish in the United States are going to be working in some of the most backbreaking positions. They are going to be building railroads. They're going to be building canals. They are going to be working on roads. They're going to be working in factories. Irish immigrants are going to be discriminated against because, again, a lot of people are going to accuse them of stealing their jobs. A lot of people are going to suspect them of being loyal to the Pope because many of them are going to be Catholics. Many of them are going to be Catholics, and in the United States, Protestants are at this time, especially Protestants, are going to be in political power in most places, and there's going to be an extreme amount of distrust of Catholics and Catholicism generally. So that is going to lead to a bunch of persecution of the Irish Americans. We look at slide 35. That is the total number of immigrants per by 5-year period. You can see that the total number of immigrants from 1841 to 45 was 430,000, and very quickly from 51 to 55 is going to be it's going to be quadruple that. So these are years of explosive growth in immigration. On slide 36, you see some locally issued currency. Banks were not able to, banks were able to issue their own currency, and so there was a bunch of different currencies in circulation prior to the Civil War. This currency was issued by a bank in Maine, and you can see that they had a bunch of women on their money, and these women were, in fact, working in mills. So you can see how absolutely central the idea of textile mills were in New England. This is Bishop Hill, Illinois, on slide 37, talking about a bunch of migrants that had settled in a tightly knit community, worked collectively to plant some agricultural crops. So not only were immigrants working in urban settings, working in industrial settings, but they were also working on the farms. Let's take a look at slide 38. Slide 38 talks about the rise of nativism. Nativism is the idea that anybody who is born in the United States should necessarily be skeptical of anybody who is coming to the United States. This is something that has been a repeating theme in American history, is to be absolutely skeptical of people who are immigrating to the United States, even though the United States is a nation of immigrants. It has been necessarily the case that with each succeeding wave of immigration to the United States, the people who immigrated just before that consider themselves to be Native Americans, to be nativists, and they say that this new batch of immigrants is the wrong type of immigrant, and that they were the correct type of immigrant, and they're very skeptical of the new immigrants coming to America, because they're saying, oh, these new immigrants represent something fundamentally un-American. This is a long, long history in the United States. Nativism is going to see some of its most popular incarnations in a little bit later on, but nativism is really going to rise up as the immigration in this period rises as well. If we look at the sources of immigration in 1850, on slide 39, you can see that there is a majority of immigrants, well, actually not a majority, but a plurality of immigrants coming from Ireland. So in 1850, about 44% of immigrants to this country were coming from Ireland. About 21% were coming from Germany, 14% from England, and other sources contributed 21%. And again, the backlash, the anti-Catholicism and anti-immigrant sentiment was certainly felt in a number of places. Slide 40 shows the riot in Philadelphia, depicting a riot where some nativists went ahead and rioted against a bunch of Roman Catholics, Irish Catholics, and it left 15 people dead. It the whole trouble was stirred up over the controversy of which version of the Bible to use in public schools. And so this is one of the reasons why Catholics have established their own Catholic schools, so that they could be in control of the curriculum to a large extent. And that's one of the reasons why there's a huge swath of America that sends their children to private Catholic schools. Slide number 41 shows the Ursuline Convent, Charlestown, Massachusetts. Ursuline Convent, the Ursuline nuns were Catholic nuns. Did a bunch of great things in terms of education and healthcare work, and just kind of taking care of members of society that had been in dire need. In Charlestown, Massachusetts, a mob burned their convent in 1834. So even members of the community that were seen doing a bunch of really, really good work, if they were Catholic, they were very much marginalized and very much discriminated against. Slide 42 talks about the transformation of the law. The law in the United States is going to, at least in Foner's opinion, it's going to increasingly support business and shield businesses from having to be accountable for different kinds of liabilities. Also, there's going to be a kind of legal revolution where corporations are going to be seen as the kind of preferred business model. If you go into business, you can form a partnership. You can be a sole proprietorship. There are all kinds of business organizations. But if you form a lot of those kinds of organizations, if something happens at the business, you can be sued and you can lose a bunch of money. If you incorporate, you form a legal entity that is a corporation. And if you incorporate, then even if I am in control of the corporation, even if I am the CEO, the president of the corporation, if the corporation does something bad, then I can't be sued personally for it. I don't end up bankrupt. Nobody can come take my house. Nobody can take my life savings. They can just do something to the corporation, and they can seize the corporation's assets. And so, during this time, there is going to be a kind of a realization by a bunch of very enterprising business owners that they should form these corporations because it provides them a great deal of legal protection against being sued. All right. Slide number 43 looks at the focus question of how did the meanings of American freedom change in this period? Guys, I am not going to hit on this subject that much because I don't really think it needs needs that much discussion. I'm going to skip ahead to slide 50 and talk about the religious revivals during the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening, very, very similar to the First Great Awakening. It is going to be necessarily a time of pluralization of American religious sentiments. You're going to see a number of people branching off in a bunch of different directions. Their religious kind of affiliations. The people who kind of organized this and really pushed for the Second Great Awakening were members of the clergy who were very concerned that church attendance had dropped extremely, extremely low. And it probably reached its height around 1820, 1830. Yeah, the Second Great Awakening democratized the American church, or American Christianity, I should say, and allowed for a bunch of people to become individually kind of invested in religious and spiritual life. And it allowed for people to kind of reinforce the idea that they were going to be allowed to interpret and kind of arrive at their own understanding of what their spiritual life should entail. The impact of the Great Awakening, or the impact of the Second Great Awakening, was going to be that necessarily a bunch of people not only felt that they had an individual ability to interpret religious doctrine and come up with their own kind of religious spiritual sensibilities, but also there was going to be a huge portion of the spiritual leaders of the Great Awakening, or the Second Great Awakening, that were going to offer very harsh critiques of the modern kind of economy and the market revolution, because most of the market revolution is based on this idea of accumulating wealth and accumulating economic opportunity, and a bunch of these religious leaders are going to criticize that and say it's not. That's not the actual point of life. And this constant accumulation and this increasing rapidity with which people are trying to engage in business and trying to engage in business transactions, and the speeding up of life and the speeding up of life and the speeding up of life. This is getting away from what people should be focused on entirely. So, slide 51 shows some Anabaptists, ceremony of Anabaptists, one of the number of different religious groups that the Anabaptists have been around for since the Protestant Reformation, but they're going to again be yet another faction, another group that can kind of offer an interpretation, and a number of Americans are going to kind of decide to perhaps potentially take on a new kind of spiritual sentiment. Slide 52 says the New Jerusalem in German. It's a watercolor. Illustrates that there's a gateway that's leading to heaven, and then some people are getting kind of sidetracked and they're ending up in hell. One of the biggest religious developments in this period of time is going to be the emergence of the emergence of Mormonism. Mormonism is founded in the 1820s by a man named Joseph Smith in upstate New York. Depending on one's point of view, the Book of Mormon is either a divinely inspired holy book or an impressive piece of American literature. It tells the story of some people who travel from ancient Middle East to the American continent, and then are going to have Jesus Christ appear to them in the Americas, which is going to be a pretty big departure from the biblical narrative of the traditional Christian biblical narrative. So almost immediately, Mormons are going to be subjected to a bunch of persecution, a bunch of discrimination. I don't want to say one of the central tenets, but one of the tenets of Mormonism is a belief in polygamy, so multiple marriages, a man being married to more than one wife, and to a number of Americans, this is seen as extremely foreign and extremely strange and extremely suspect. And so Joseph Smith is constantly going to be relocating his followers who are going to live together in close-knit communities, relocating those communities further and further west. Joseph Smith is going to get his followers to all the way to Nauvoo, Illinois, and he's going to be arrested, and then a crowd of people is going to break into the jail, and they're going to go ahead and kill Joseph Smith. At that point, Mormons decide that it's really probably best if they just go as far out as they possibly can and get out of American society almost completely. So Brigham Young takes over from Joseph Smith's departure and leads over 2,000 followers, 2,000 Mormons, to the Great Salt Lake, to Salt Lake City in what is present-day Utah, and that is where the Mormons are going to essentially set up their base of operations. And to this day, I mean, certainly, if you're traveling to Salt Lake City, Utah, you will be experiencing a great deal of Mormon culture and having the chance to meet a number of Mormons. In fact, they're all around us. Yeah. There's a number of Mormons in Bakersfield community, certainly. Slide 54 talks about the Mormon temple in Nauvoo, Illinois. It shows, it's a picture of that temple. That is where we're going to end it for today. I'm not going to make too many comments about women in the workforce and labor organization, but I know that you guys can read and take care of that on your own. I will upload this, and then hopefully you'll be able to answer any questions you have from 4 to 5:15 today. All right. Make sure to watch some of the videos. I've got a great crash course video up there, and then 4 rather short videos of Eric Foner commenting on topics from this chapter. All right, we'll talk to you soon.